On a quiet morning in 1995, in a small suburban neighborhood in Clarion, Pennsylvania, a 7-year-old girl named Chloe Holloway suddenly vanished without a trace, and police found no evidence, leaving the entire community terrified and confused. More than 25 years later, her mother decided to finally pack up the old family home and stumbled upon an unopened birthday gift. And what she found inside that forgotten box exposed a dark secret that changed everything forever. Clarion was the kind of town where nobody ever locked their front doors. It was a peaceful place surrounded by thick oak forests, rolling hills, and quiet residential streets lined with old two-story houses. Children rode their bicycles along the sidewalks until the streetlights flickered on, and neighbors gathered on their front porches every evening to talk about the weather, local high school football games, and upcoming weekend church suppers. Crime was something that happened in distant cities on the evening news, not on Birch Street. Maggie Holloway loved her quiet life in Clarion. She was 32 years old in the autumn of 1995, working part-time as an assistant at the local public library. Her days were structured around her family. Her husband, Arthur, worked long hours at the nearby paper mill, taking extra night shifts whenever he could so they could save up for a proper vacation. Their home was always filled with noise, warmth, and the comforting smell of home-cooked meals. Maggie and Arthur had 2 children. Their eldest was 10-year-old Toby, a quiet and protective boy who loved reading comic books and building complex wooden models in his bedroom. Their youngest was Chloe, who was just 2 days away from her 7th birthday. Chloe was a bright, cheerful child with soft, curly brown hair, big green eyes, and a laughter that seemed to light up every room she entered. She had a habit of collecting colorful autumn leaves in her coat pockets whenever she walked home from kindergarten. Every surface in the Holloway kitchen was covered in Chloe's drawings. She loved drawing bright yellow suns, giant purple flowers, and stick-figure portraits of her family standing in front of their yellow house. As October settled over Clarion, the entire Holloway home was buzzing with excitement for Chloe's upcoming 7th birthday. The big celebration was scheduled for Saturday, October 14th. For weeks, Chloe had been counting down the days on a small hand-drawn calendar taped to the front of the refrigerator, crossing off each morning with a thick red crayon. She talked about her party constantly, asking her mother if they could make a strawberry cake with pink frosting, and if her best friend from down the street could bring her pet rabbit over to play. On the Monday before her birthday, Maggie went down to the small department store in town to buy Chloe's main gift. Chloe had been asking for a special hand-painted wooden music box for months, one with a tiny ballerina that spun around to a soft lullaby melody whenever the lid was lifted. Maggie had searched 3 different towns before finally finding the exact music box Chloe wanted. When Maggie got back home that afternoon, she spent nearly an hour carefully wrapping the box in bright pink paper, decorating it with silver ribbons and a shiny silver bow. She tucked a handwritten birthday card under the ribbon, expressing how deeply she loved her daughter. She hid the wrapped present high up on the top shelf of her master bedroom closet, buried behind a stack of extra winter blankets where curious little eyes would never find it. Thursday, October 12th, started like any other ordinary autumn day. The morning air was crisp and cool, carrying the sweet scent of wood smoke and damp fallen leaves. Arthur had left for his early morning shift at the mill before dawn. Toby ate his bowl of cereal at the kitchen table while Maggie combed Chloe's curls and tied a soft pink wool headband around her hair to keep it out of her face. Maggie walked both children to the end of the driveway at 8:30. She kissed Chloe on the cheek and reminded her to be good in school. Chloe giggled, adjusted her small yellow backpack, and skipped toward the elementary school 3 blocks away. At noon, Maggie walked down to the school to pick Chloe up after her half-day kindergarten session ended. The walk back home was peaceful. Chloe held her mother's hand, chattering happily about a story her teacher had read to the class, and reminding Maggie that her birthday was only 48 hours away. When they got home, Maggie made grilled cheese sandwiches and poured 2 glasses of apple cider. They sat together at the wooden kitchen table, talking and laughing. Chloe drew another picture on a paper napkin, a drawing of herself wearing a party hat next to a giant pink birthday cake. At 3:15 in the afternoon, 10-year-old Toby arrived home from school. He took an apple from the fruit bowl, grabbed his homework folder, and went straight upstairs to his bedroom to study. By 3:30, the afternoon sun was still warm and bright. Chloe put on her light denim jacket and asked if she could go play in the backyard. The Holloway backyard was fully fenced in with a neat white wooden fence. It was a safe space where Chloe had played hundreds of times before. The back gate led out toward a thick line of trees that separated the neighborhood from a small public nature park. Maggie told Chloe she could play outside for half an hour while she finished cleaning the kitchen and preparing dinner. She reminded Chloe to stay inside the fence and keep the gate closed. Chloe promised she would, grabbing her small plastic toy rake to build a pile of dried leaves near the center of the yard. Through the large glass window above the kitchen sink, Maggie watched her daughter play. Chloe was singing softly to herself, happily raking bright red and gold leaves into a neat pile near the wooden swing set. Everything felt peaceful, calm, and safe. It didn't feel like a day where anything terrible could happen. It just didn't. At 3:45, the landline telephone in the hallway rang. Maggie wiped her wet hands on a dish towel and walked out of the kitchen into the hallway to answer it. It was Arthur calling from the mill to let her know he would have to work 2 hours of overtime that evening to cover for a coworker who had called in sick. Maggie talked to Arthur for less than 4 minutes. They discussed dinner plans and confirmed the arrangements for Chloe's birthday party on Saturday. It was an ordinary, mundane conversation between a husband and wife. When Maggie hung up the receiver at 3:49, she walked straight back into the kitchen. She looked out the window over the sink to check on Chloe. The backyard was quiet. The small pile of autumn leaves sat in the middle of the lawn, surrounded by green grass. The pink plastic toy rake was lying flat on the ground next to the swing set, but Chloe was not there. At first, Maggie did not panic. She assumed Chloe had stepped around the side of the garage or walked behind the old wooden shed to look for more leaves. She opened the back door and stepped out onto the wooden porch, calling her daughter's name into the cool air. Her voice echoed across the quiet yard, but there was no response. The only sound was the gentle rustling of wind through the oak trees at the edge of the property. Maggie walked down the porch steps and crossed the lawn. She checked behind the garage. She looked inside the small wooden garden shed. Chloe was nowhere to be seen. That was when Maggie noticed the back gate. The wooden gate, which was always securely latched to keep Chloe safe inside the yard, was resting half open. It was swinging gently back and forth in the wind, making a faint creaking noise that sent a sudden cold wave of dread straight through Maggie's chest. Maggie ran to the gate and looked out toward the tree line. The narrow dirt trail leading into the woods was empty. Leaves blew across the path, but there was no sign of her little girl. Panic set in fast. It hit Maggie like a sudden blow to the stomach. She turned around and sprinted back toward the house, screaming Chloe's name at the top of her lungs. Toby ran down the stairs, his eyes wide with fear when he saw the expression on his mother's face. Maggie told him to check every room in the house, every closet, and under every bed, just in case Chloe had come inside without making a sound. Toby rushed through the house, opening doors and calling for his little sister, but every room was empty. Maggie ran down the street to her neighbor's house. Evelyn Miller, a woman in her late 50s who lived 2 doors down and often watched the children when Maggie ran errands, came out onto her porch in surprise. Maggie was hyperventilating, barely able to form words as she explained that Chloe was missing from the backyard. Evelyn immediately joined the search. Together with Toby, they walked up and down Birch Street, knocking on doors, searching front yards, and yelling Chloe's name until their throats felt raw. None of the neighbors had seen her. No one had heard anything unusual. The street was completely quiet, just like it was every other afternoon. By 4:15 afternoon, exactly 30 minutes after Chloe had last been seen playing in the yard, Maggie ran back into her hallway with trembling hands. She picked up the telephone and dialed 911. Her voice was shaking violently as she told the dispatcher that her 7-year-old daughter had vanished from her backyard. Within 7 minutes, the first police cruisers arrived on Birch Street, their red and blue lights flashing against the quiet residential homes. Neighbors stepped out onto their lawns, watching in shock and disbelief as officers quickly set up a perimeter around the Holloway house. If you want more emotional cold case stories like this, please subscribe. Your support truly means a lot to us. Lead investigator Detective Paul Vance, an experienced officer who had served on the Clarion police force for over 15 years, arrived at the scene shortly before 5 o'clock. He took control of the situation immediately, ordering officers to search every backyard, alleyway, and shed within a 4-block radius. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long dark shadows across the neighborhood, search teams swept through the thick woods behind the Holloway property. Flashlight beams cut through the growing darkness as officers and local volunteers moved through the trees, calling Chloe's name into the autumn night. Around 6:30 that evening, an officer searching near the edge of the wooded trail made a discovery. Caught on a sharp thorn branch about 50 yards past the open back gate was a small piece of cloth. It was Chloe's soft pink wool headband, the one her mother had tied around her hair that very morning. The headband was undamaged, but it was sitting right at the edge of a narrow dirt access road that cut through the back of the woods, a secluded gravel road used occasionally by local utility trucks and private vehicles. Detective Vance walked back to the house to speak with Maggie, holding the headband in a clear plastic evidence bag. Maggie broke down in tears the moment she saw it, clutching Arthur's hand tightly as her husband stood beside her, his face pale and paralyzed with shock. Detective Vance sat down across from Maggie at the kitchen table. He looked at her closely, his voice low and serious. "Mrs. Holloway," he said softly, "we need to go over every single detail from this afternoon. Think carefully. Did you notice anyone walking down your street today? Did you see any unfamiliar cars parked nearby, or anyone standing near your back fence while Chloe was playing?" Maggie wiped her eyes with a tissue, her body shaking with grief. She opened her mouth to say no, but then she froze. A sudden memory flashed through her mind, a small, chilling detail that she had completely overlooked in the chaos of the afternoon. Just 30 minutes before Chloe disappeared, while Maggie was standing at the kitchen window washing dishes, she had glanced out toward the back tree line. She remembered seeing a dark blue sedan idling quietly on the gravel access road behind the fence. The car had its engine running, and through the tinted glass, she had seen the silhouette of someone sitting in the driver's seat, watching the backyard. At the time, she had assumed it was just a utility worker taking a break, but now, the memory sent a wave of absolute terror through her soul. Did the person in that dark car kidnap Chloe right out of her own backyard? Or was there something far more personal and horrifying happening behind the scenes that no one in the Holloway family was prepared to face? Detective Vance immediately called for additional units to secure the gravel access road running behind the Holloway property. Within 20 minutes, bright yellow police tape was stretched between the trees, closing off the narrow dirt path. Investigators moved along the brush with flashlights pressed low to the ground, searching for anything that might lead them to the missing child. On the soft, damp dirt near the edge of the tree line, Vance found what appeared to be faint tire impressions. The marks indicated that a vehicle had been parked there recently, idling just feet away from the wooden fence. However, before the forensic team could properly measure or take plaster casts of the tracks, the weather turned against them. Dark rain clouds rolled over Clarion, and a heavy autumn downpour began to sweep through the woods. Within an hour, the rain had completely washed away the tire impressions, leaving behind nothing but muddy puddles. It was a devastating blow to the investigation, but Detective Vance refused to let his team slow down. By the early hours of Friday, October 13th, the search for 7-year-old Chloe Holloway had turned into one of the largest police operations in the history of Clarion County. State troopers arrived with search dogs, setting up a command center in the parking lot of the nearby community center. Dozens of local residents, moved by the heartbreak of the Holloway family, gathered in the cold rain to offer their help. They were handed flashlights, maps, and bright neon vests before fanning out across the surrounding countryside. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging cameras flew low over the dense forests, their searchlights sweeping across the canopy of trees. Search teams walked shoulder to shoulder through the mud, pushing through thick brambles, searching empty barns, abandoned sheds, and flooded ditches. Bloodhounds were brought in to trace Chloe's scent from her bedroom. The dogs followed her trail out the back door, across the lawn to the swing set, and straight through the open wooden gate to the gravel road. But once they reached the spot where the tire marks had been seen, the scent vanished completely into thin air. It confirmed the police department's worst fear. Chloe had not simply wandered off into the woods and gotten lost. She had been taken from the edge of her own yard in a motor vehicle. Inside the Holloway home, time seemed to stand completely still. Maggie sat at the kitchen table, clutching a cold cup of coffee that she hadn't touched in hours. She stared endlessly out the window at the empty swing set swaying in the wind. Guilt was eating away at her heart like a quiet poison. She kept replaying those few minutes in her head over and over again. If only she hadn't answered the telephone. If only she had stayed at the kitchen window for 4 more minutes. If only she had walked out to check on that dark blue sedan the moment she noticed it sitting on the gravel road. The thoughts cycled through her mind without stopping, driving her to tears every time the room grew quiet. Arthur sat beside her, his face pale and haggard. He held her hand tightly, trying to remain strong for his wife and son, but his own grief was overwhelming. In the quiet hours of the night, when he thought no one was watching, Arthur went down into the basement and wept quietly into his hands, completely shattered by the helplessness of the situation. 10-year-old Toby spent most of the day sitting on his bed, staring at the floor. He felt a heavy weight of responsibility resting on his shoulders. He was the older brother. He had been upstairs in his room, just 20 feet above the backyard, while his little sister was being taken. He kept asking himself why he hadn't looked out his bedroom window, why he hadn't heard a car door shut, or why he hadn't heard Chloe call out. The silence in the house was unbearable to him. By Friday afternoon, police officers had printed thousands of missing person flyers featuring Chloe's bright, smiling kindergarten photo. Volunteers taped them to storefront windows, gas station pumps, telephone poles, and church bulletin boards all across the region. Local television stations broadcast her description every hour, asking anyone who had seen a dark blue sedan in the Clarion area on Thursday afternoon to call the emergency hotline immediately. Detective Vance and his team began a systematic canvass of the entire county. They cross-referenced state vehicle records, compiling a list of every registered dark blue sedan in Clarion and the surrounding counties of Venango, Jefferson, and Forest. Over 200 vehicle owners were identified and visited by investigators. Police officers inspected tires, searched trunks, and questioned drivers about their whereabouts on the afternoon of October 12th. Mechanics at local auto repair shops were interviewed to see if anyone had brought in a blue car for sudden repairs or cleaning. Yet, despite interviewing dozens of drivers, every single lead resulted in a dead end. Every driver had a verified alibi, a clear record, or a reason for being nowhere near Birch Street that afternoon. As the days dragged on, the atmosphere in the small town of Clarion shifted dramatically. The warm sense of community and trust that had defined the neighborhood for decades began to dissolve into fear and suspicion. Parents stopped letting their children play in their front yards. Doors that had remained unlocked for generations were now bolted tight. Neighbors looked at one another with quiet doubt, wondering if someone living right among them possessed a dark and hidden secret. Saturday, October 14th, arrived with a cold, gray sky. It was the day Chloe was supposed to turn 7 years old. In the Holloway home, no one spoke about the date, but the pain was visible in everyone's eyes. The hand-drawn calendar still hung on the front of the refrigerator, with the red crayon mark resting on October 12th, the day everything had been torn apart. Upstairs in the master bedroom closet, sitting high on the top shelf behind a stack of folded winter blankets, was the unopened birthday present. The hand-painted wooden music box remained wrapped in its bright pink paper, tied with a silver ribbon and bow. Maggie could not bring herself to go into the closet. The thought of seeing that pink box tore her heart into pieces. Weeks passed, turning into cold autumn months, but the investigation yielded no major breakthroughs. Detective Vance stayed late at the police station night after night, sitting at a desk covered with witness statements, map printouts, and field reports. He interviewed local delivery drivers, utility workers, and mail carriers who routinely drove through the neighborhood. None of them recalled seeing anything unusual on the gravel road behind the Holloway home that afternoon. The police also looked into potential suspects with past criminal records in the tri-state area. Dozens of individuals were brought in for intensive questioning, but their alibis held firm, or physical evidence completely ruled them out. False tips began to pour in from well-meaning citizens who claimed to have seen a girl matching Chloe's description in distant towns, at highway rest stops, or inside diner booths. Investigators tracked down every single report, traveling to neighboring states to check security tapes and talk to witnesses, only to find that every sighting was a case of mistaken identity. Strange, cruel hoax calls were even made to the Holloway residence late at night by people seeking attention or money, forcing the police to place a trace on the family phone line. Every call was investigated, but none of them brought the family any closer to finding their daughter. By the time the first snow of winter fell over Clarion, covering the forest paths and the Holloway backyard in a thick blanket of white, the initial wave of search efforts had gradually wound down. The search command center at the community center was eventually dismantled. The news crews that had once lined Birch Street packed up their satellite trucks and moved on to other stories. The missing person flyers on the telephone poles began to fade and tear under the harsh winter wind. The case, which had once consumed the entire state, was slowly growing cold. If you want more emotional cold case stories like this, please subscribe. Your support truly means a lot to us. In late November, nearly 7 weeks after Chloe had disappeared, Detective Vance decided to go back to the very beginning of the investigation. He believed that in the chaos of those first few hours, something small might have been missed. He pulled every file, every statement, and every piece of recorded audio gathered on the day of the disappearance, intending to review them line by line. Among the items collected during the initial neighborhood canvass was an audio cassette tape from an answering machine belonging to Mrs. Gable, an elderly woman who lived directly across the street from the Holloways. Mrs. Gable had been out of town on the day Chloe went missing, but her answering machine had recorded an incoming call at 3:42 that afternoon, just minutes before Chloe vanished. The call itself was merely a wrong number, but because Mrs. Gable kept her front window slightly open to let in the cool autumn air, the sensitive microphone on her kitchen machine had picked up background audio from outside while the machine was recording its message. In October, officers had quickly listened to the recording, heard only the wrong number caller, and archived the tape as routine evidence. But Detective Vance decided to take the tape to a specialized audio laboratory operated by the state police in Harrisburg to have the background noise cleaned up and amplified. A week later, Vance sat in a small, soundproof room at the state police laboratory, wearing heavy headphones. The audio technician adjusted the frequencies, filtering out the hiss of the tape and the tone of the answering machine, bringing the faint sounds from across the street into clear focus. Through the headphones, Vance heard the quiet rustling of wind and distant leaves. Then, faint but unmistakably clear, he heard the cheerful sound of a child's voice coming from the direction of the Holloway yard. It was Chloe. Vance leaned forward, his heart pounding in his chest as he listened closely. There was no sound of a struggle. There was no cry of fear, no scream for help, and no sound of running feet. Instead, Chloe's voice sounded light, excited, and completely relaxed. On the tape, she could be heard giggling softly before speaking directly to someone standing at the back gate. She said 4 distinct words that made Detective Vance's blood run completely cold. "You brought it back." The recording ended abruptly as the answering machine disconnected. Detective Vance sat back in his chair, staring at the spinning reels of the tape recorder in absolute disbelief. The realization hit him like a cold shock. Chloe had not been grabbed by a total stranger lurking in the woods. She had walked to that back gate willingly, speaking with familiar delight to someone she already knew, someone who had brought her something she recognized. Who had stood at that back gate in the quiet afternoon? And what object had they brought with them that was powerful enough to make a 7-year-old girl step out of her safe backyard without making a single sound? The discovery of the audio tape sent shockwaves through the investigation, but it raised far more terrifying questions than it answered. Detective Vance played the cleaned-up recording for Maggie and Arthur in the quiet living room of their home. When Maggie heard her daughter's sweet, innocent voice softly giggling and saying, "You brought it back," she covered her mouth with both hands, tears streaming down her face. Arthur stared at the tape player in absolute disbelief, his jaw clenched as he tried to process what he was hearing. The words changed everything. They meant that Chloe had not been grabbed by a total stranger hiding in the shadows of the woods. She had not been forced into a vehicle against her will, nor had she cried out for help. She had walked to that back gate willingly, smiling and relaxed, because she recognized the person standing on the other side. And even more disturbing was the fact that this person had enticed her by returning an object that Chloe thought she had lost. Detective Vance sat with Maggie for hours, asking her to recall every toy, doll, coat, or trinket that Chloe had misplaced in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. Maggie went through Chloe's bedroom, opening drawers, searching toy bins, and inspecting every corner of the room. That was when Maggie remembered a small detail that had seemed completely insignificant at the time. About 10 days before Chloe vanished, she had lost her favorite toy, a small, handmade cloth doll with bright yellow yarn hair and a hand-sewn blue dress that her grandmother had made for her 5th birthday. Chloe was deeply attached to that doll and slept with it every single night. When the doll vanished from her bedroom, Chloe had cried for 2 days straight. Maggie had searched the entire house, turning over cushions and checking under beds, but the doll was nowhere to be found. Maggie had assumed her daughter had dropped it somewhere at school or accidentally left it at a friend's house. Now, sitting on the edge of Chloe's bed, Detective Vance realized the dark truth. The person who took Chloe had stolen that yellow yarn doll from inside the Holloway home or yard days in advance. They had kept it, waited for the right moment, and then brought it back to the fence on Thursday afternoon, using the child's favorite toy to lure her quietly through the back gate without making a sound. This realization meant the culprit was not a random intruder passing through Clarion. It was someone who had access to the Holloway house, someone who knew the family's daily routines, someone who knew which toy Chloe loved most, and someone whom 7-year-old Chloe trusted completely. Detective Vance immediately shifted the focus of the case. He began re-interviewing everyone who had been inside the Holloway house during the month of October. He questioned close friends, extended family members, neighbors, repairmen, and utility workers. Evelyn Miller, the neighbor down the street, was questioned again. Arthur's younger brother, Ray, who occasionally stayed on the living room couch when visiting from out of town, was brought in for intense interrogation. The local contractor who had serviced the house's heating unit in late September was tracked down and questioned. Yet, despite weeks of rigorous background checks, polygraph tests, and alibi verifications, every single person in the family circle had a solid, verifiable alibi for the afternoon of October 12th. Evelyn had been at a doctor's appointment 3 towns over, backed by medical receipts and time stamps. Arthur's brother Ray had been working a documented shift at a construction site in Ohio. The heating contractor had been on a job site with 4 other crew members all afternoon. No matter where Detective Vance turned, every clue seemed to dissolve into a wall of dead ends. There were no fingerprints on the back gate, no new witness statements, and no sign of the dark blue sedan. The investigation was trapped in a maze with no exit. As autumn turned to winter, and winter turned to spring, the daily phone calls from the police department began to slow down. Months stretched into years. The missing person posters that once covered the storefront windows of Clarion slowly yellowed, peeled away, and were replaced by local advertisements. The headlines faded from the front pages of newspapers, and the tragic disappearance of Chloe Holloway gradually transitioned from an active investigation into a cold case. The passage of time did not heal the wounds inside the Holloway home, it only deepened them. The silence in the house became a permanent resident. Arthur attempted to keep his family together, but the weight of unresolved grief broke his spirit. He spent his evenings sitting quietly in the living room, staring at old family photo albums, replaying that terrible afternoon over and over in his mind. He blamed himself for working overtime, believing that if he had come home early, he might have seen the dark blue car parked on the gravel road. The constant stress and heartbreak took a heavy toll on his physical health. In the spring of 2015, 20 years after Chloe vanished, Arthur suffered a massive heart attack and passed away at the age of 57. On his deathbed in the local hospital, holding Maggie's trembling hand, his final whispered words were about his missing daughter. He died without ever knowing the truth. Toby grew into a quiet, serious man. The guilt of being upstairs in his bedroom when his sister was taken stayed with him throughout his youth. He graduated from high school, attended college, and eventually moved 2 hours away to Pittsburgh to work as an accountant. He built a quiet life for himself, but he returned to Clarion every single weekend to check on his mother. He never stopped looking at passing cars, always searching for a glimpse of a familiar face in a crowd. Maggie remained alone in the 2-story house on Birch Street. As the years went by, the neighborhood around her changed. Old neighbors moved away or passed on, new families moved in, and children who hadn't even been born in 1995 played on the sidewalks. But inside Maggie's house, time remained frozen in October 1995. Chloe's bedroom was kept exactly as she had left it. The small yellow backpack sat near the doorway. Her bed was neatly made with her favorite floral sheets. On the kitchen refrigerator, the paper napkin drawing of the pink birthday cake remained taped to the door, its colors fading to a soft yellow under 25 years of dust. By the autumn of 2020, 25 years had passed since the afternoon Chloe walked out into the backyard. Maggie was now 62 years old. Her hair had turned completely silver, her health was frail, and the physical demands of maintaining the large, aging house had become too much for her to handle alone. After months of gentle convincing, Toby finally persuaded his mother that it was time to sell the family home and move into a quiet, single-story apartment near his home in Pittsburgh. Packing up 25 years of memories was an agonizing emotional process. Every box Maggie packed felt like a betrayal. Sorting through Arthur's old tools, clearing out family kitchenware, and packing away old photo albums brought back waves of grief that made it difficult for her to breathe. Leaving Birch Street felt as though she was abandoning Chloe all over again, leaving behind the last place where her daughter had ever been safe. Toby spent every weekend in October 2020 helping his mother pack room by room. They filled dozens of cardboard boxes, stacking them in the living room ready for the moving truck. They left the master bedroom for the very last day. On a chilly Saturday afternoon in late October, exactly 25 years after the disappearance, Maggie stood alone inside her master bedroom. The room was stripped bare, the curtains down, and the floor covered in empty boxes. The only area left untouched was the deep walk-in closet. Maggie stepped inside the closet. The air smelled faintly of cedar wood, old lavender, and dusty wool. She brought a small wooden step stool from the hallway and placed it beneath the highest shelf, a deep, dark ledge where she hadn't looked or reached in over 2 decades. She climbed onto the stool and stretched her arm toward the back of the top shelf. Her fingers brushed past dusty winter blankets, old coat hangers, and forgotten shoe boxes. Then, in the far back corner, hidden behind a heavy stack of wool quilts, her hand touched a hard, rectangular box. Maggie pulled the package forward into the light, and her breath caught in her throat. It was the unopened birthday gift from October 1995, the hand-painted wooden music box she had bought for Chloe's 7th birthday. For 25 years, the present had rested on that top shelf, completely forgotten during the chaos of police searches, media interviews, and decades of silent grief. The wrapping paper, which had once been a bright, vibrant strawberry pink, was now faded to a pale, dusty rose. The silver ribbon had lost its shine, and the edges of the paper were brittle and yellowed with age. Tucked neatly under the bow was the handwritten card Maggie had written 25 years ago, bearing the words, "Happy 7th birthday, sweet Chloe. Love, Mom." Maggie climbed down from the step stool, clutching the wrapped package to her chest. She sat down on the edge of her bare mattress, her body shaking as tears overflowed down her cheeks. The physical object seemed to bridge the quarter-century gap, bringing the pain of October 1995 rushing back with overwhelming force. Toby walked into the master bedroom holding an empty packing tape dispenser. When he saw his mother sitting on the bed weeping while clutching the pink package, he stopped dead in his tracks. He recognized the pink wrapping paper immediately from his childhood memories. Toby walked over silently, sat down beside his mother on the bed, and wrapped his arm around her shoulders. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. They simply sat together in the quiet room, holding each other as the autumn wind rustled the bare oak trees outside the window. Before we continue, if this story has kept you watching, please subscribe. Your support truly means a lot to us. Maggie wiped her eyes with the sleeve of her cardigan. She looked down at the faded pink box resting in her lap. She realized she could not pack this present into a moving box and take it to Pittsburgh without opening it. She needed to touch the hand-painted wooden ballerina inside. She wanted to wind the key and hear the soft lullaby melody play just once, as a quiet tribute to the daughter she had loved and lost. With trembling fingers, Maggie carefully slid her thumbnail under the edge of the old tape, intending to unwrap the paper without tearing it. As she peeled back the faded pink paper from the side of the box, her fingers caught on something unusual. She paused and looked closer at the packaging. The tape Maggie had used to seal the gift back in 1995 was a distinct type of thick, yellowed masking tape that she had brought home from her desk at the public library. But layered directly over a clean, straight cut in that masking tape was a strip of clear, shiny commercial tape. Maggie froze. Her heart began to beat wildly against her ribs. Someone had used a razor blade to neatly slice open the wrapping paper on the side of the birthday gift after Maggie had hidden it on the top closet shelf in October 1995. Someone had opened the package, accessed the contents inside, and then carefully resealed the paper with clear tape before placing it back on the shelf, all before Chloe vanished. Toby leaned in closer, his face turning pale as he saw the double layer of tape. "Mom," he whispered, his voice trembling, "did you retape this back then?" "No," Maggie whispered, her voice barely audible. "I wrapped this box once on Monday afternoon, and I put it straight up on that shelf. Nobody was supposed to know it was up there." Her hands shaking violently, Maggie tore away the rest of the pink wrapping paper and lifted the lid of the cardboard box. Inside, resting right beside the hand-painted wooden music box, were two items that Maggie had never seen before, items that had not been in the box when she wrapped it 25 years ago. The first item was a small, rusted iron key attached to a faded green plastic key tag, stamped with the number 214. The second item was an old, developed Polaroid photograph, face down at the bottom of the box. Maggie reached into the box with a trembling hand and picked up the photograph. She turned it over into the dim afternoon light. The picture showed Chloe's missing yellow yarn doll, resting on the passenger seat of a car. But it was what appeared in the reflection of the car's interior rearview mirror that made Maggie's entire body go completely numb with shock. Reflected clearly in the mirror was the face of the person sitting in the driver's seat on that October afternoon in 1995, a face that Maggie recognized instantly, a face that belonged to someone who had been standing right beside her throughout the entire tragedy. Maggie stared at the faded Polaroid photograph resting in her trembling palm, completely unable to process what her eyes were seeing. The image was slightly blurry, yellowed around the edges by 25 years of darkness inside the closet, but the face reflected in the rearview mirror was unmistakably clear. It was not the face of a violent stranger or a wandering fugitive. It was the face of Harlan Reed, Arthur's closest childhood friend, their next-door neighbor from 2 streets over, and the man who had worked right beside Arthur at the paper mill for over 20 years. Harlan had been like an uncle to Chloe and Toby. He was the man who came over every summer to help Arthur repair the back porch, the man who brought homemade apple cider every autumn, and the man who sat at their kitchen table every single Sunday afternoon. When Chloe went missing on that terrible October day in 1995, Harlan had been one of the very first people to arrive at the house. He had organized search parties, handed out flashlights to volunteers, and wept alongside Arthur in the driveway as the police cars lined the street. Maggie's breath hitched in her chest as a cold, terrifying realization washed over her. Harlan had been standing right beside them the entire time. He had held Arthur's hand at the funeral service 20 years later, comforting the broken father who died without ever knowing that his best friend was the monster who had torn his family apart. Toby leaned over his mother's shoulder, staring at the photograph in absolute shock. His jaw trembled and his face turned completely pale as anger and grief surged through his veins. "Uncle Harlan," Toby whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. "It was Harlan. It was him the whole time." It didn't make any sense. It just didn't. Harlan was a quiet, mild-mannered man who lived alone in a modest wooden house near the river. He had no criminal record, no history of violence, and had always been treated like a member of the Holloway family. Why would he take Chloe? And why would he slice open a wrapped birthday gift inside their house to hide a photograph and a rusted key? Toby didn't hesitate. He pulled his cell phone from his pocket with shaking hands and dialed the Clarion Police Department. He demanded to speak with the lead investigator handling active cold cases, telling the dispatcher that they had just uncovered definitive physical evidence in the 1995 disappearance of Chloe Holloway. Within 30 minutes, 2 police cruisers pulled up to the house on Birch Street. Detective Marcus Miller, a sharp, middle-aged investigator who had taken over the department's cold case unit 5 years earlier, stepped out of his vehicle. Accompanying him was an elderly man walking with the aid of a wooden cane, retired Detective Paul Vance. Vance was now 78 years old, his hair entirely white and his face deeply lined with age. Even though he had retired 15 years earlier, the disappearance of little Chloe Holloway had remained the single greatest failure of his career. He had never stopped thinking about the case. When Detective Miller called him at home to tell him that Maggie Holloway had found new evidence, the retired officer had put on his coat and rushed over immediately. The four of them sat around the old wooden kitchen table, the exact same table where Detective Vance had sat 25 years earlier taking Maggie's initial statement. Detective Miller placed latex gloves on his hands and carefully picked up the faded Polaroid photograph. He examined the reflection in the rearview mirror through a small magnifying glass, comparing it to an old state driver's license photo of Harlan Reed from 1995. The match was indisputable. The facial structure, the distinct shape of the jawline, and the dark-framed eyeglasses belonged to Harlan Reed. Retired Detective Vance stared at the photograph, his hands trembling as tears filled his aged eyes. "I interviewed Harlan 3 times back in October of '95, Vance said softly, his voice heavy with deep regret. "He was on our list because he worked with Arthur and owned a blue station wagon, but he told us he was working a double shift at the mill that afternoon. His supervisor signed off on his time card, so we ruled him out. I trusted him. We all trusted him." Detective Miller then turned his attention to the second item found inside the gift box, the small, rusted iron key attached to the faded green plastic tag stamped with the number 214. Miller held the key up to the light, inspecting the green plastic tag closely. Beneath a layer of old grime and scratches, he noticed faint, embossed lettering along the bottom edge of the tag. It read, "Clarion River Mini Storage." Maggie gasped softly. Clarion River Mini Storage was an old, secluded self-storage facility located on the far outskirts of town, tucked away behind a dense patch of pine woods right along the riverbank. It was less than 4 miles from the paper mill where Arthur and Harlan had worked. Detective Vance leaned forward, his eyes wide with intensity. "In '95, we focused our search on public buildings, abandoned houses, and open woodland," Vance recalled. "We never checked private self-storage lockers unless we had a specific tip. If Harlan rented a unit out there under a fake name or paid in cash, nobody would have ever known." Detective Miller immediately got on his radio and called the station to pull the property and rental records for Clarion River Mini Storage, dating back to 1995. While waiting for the records to load, the officers examined the birthday gift box itself. They analyzed the double layer of tape, the old yellowed masking tape that Maggie had used, and the clear commercial tape applied directly over the razor cut. Detective Miller pieced together the sequence of events with chilling clarity. In October 1995, Harlan had access to the Holloway house. He possessed a spare house key that Arthur had given him years earlier for emergencies. Sometime during the week leading up to Chloe's birthday, Harlan had entered the house while Maggie was out running errands or picking the children up from school. He had gone upstairs to the master bedroom closet, located the wrapped present on the top shelf, and used a pocket knife to slice open the side of the box. He slipped the key and the photograph inside, sealing it back up with clear tape. He had done it as a sick, twisted trophy, a way to keep a permanent record of his crime hidden inside the victim's own home, right under the family's noses. Harlan had assumed that once Chloe went missing on Thursday, the birthday party on Saturday would be canceled, and the wrapped present would sit untouched on that top shelf for weeks, if not forever. He was right. Maggie had been so consumed by heartbreak that she had never touched the box again until 25 years later. 20 minutes later, Detective Miller's radio crackled to life. A junior officer from the station reported that historical records for Clarion River Mini Storage showed Unit 214 had been continuously rented since September 1995. The rental agreement was under the alias Henry Reed, but the monthly payments had been made consistently for 25 years straight via cash mailed in plain envelopes to the facility's post office box. The payments were still current. Someone was still paying to keep Unit 214 locked and secured in 2020. Detective Miller stood up from the table, his face set with fierce determination. "We're getting a search warrant right now," he stated firmly. "We're going to open locker 214. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, a fleet of police cruisers, forensic vans, and mobile lab units pulled up to the iron gates of Clarion River Mini Storage. The facility was quiet, surrounded by tall chain-link fencing and rusting corrugated steel buildings. Maggie and Toby sat in the back of Detective Miller's unmarked vehicle, watching as officers carrying bolt cutters and heavy toolkits marched down the narrow gravel road toward the back of the property. Retired Detective Vance walked slowly behind them, refusing to stay in the car. He needed to see what was inside locker 214 with his own eyes. Row by row, they searched until they reached the far corner of the facility. There, standing at the very end of a dark, gravel alleyway, was Unit 214. The heavy metal roll-up door was covered in a thick layer of rust and dirt. Attached to the bottom latch was a heavy, tarnished iron padlock, the exact same lock that matched the rusted key found inside Chloe's birthday gift. Detective Miller stepped forward, taking the rusted key from a plastic evidence bag. He inserted the key into the padlock. The mechanism was stiff from decades of exposure to moisture and cold air, but after a firm turn, a sharp metallic click echoed through the quiet alleyway. The lock opened. Miller removed the padlock and grabbed the bottom handle of the metal door. Two officers stepped up beside him to help lift the heavy, rusted door. With a loud, grinding screech of metal against metal, they pulled the door upward, rolling it into the ceiling of the unit. A thick, suffocating cloud of dust, damp air, and the smell of ancient motor oil poured out of the locker into the afternoon air. The officers shone high-powered tactical flashlights into the pitch-black darkness of the storage unit. As the beams of light cut through the dust, everyone standing in the alleyway gasped in absolute disbelief. Parked inside the center of locker 214, covered beneath a heavy, dust-coated canvas tarp, was a vehicle. Detective Miller walked inside, reached out with gloved hands, and pulled the tarp back. Revealed beneath the dusty canvas was a dark blue 1988 Ford station wagon, the exact dark blue sedan that Maggie had spotted idling on the gravel road behind her backyard 25 years ago. The car had sat in the dark locker since October 1995. Its tires were completely flat, resting on the concrete floor, and its windows were covered in grime. Harlan had driven the car straight into the storage locker shortly after taking Chloe, covering it up and leaving it hidden from the world for a quarter of a century. Forensic technicians immediately moved into the unit with cameras, capturing every inch of the vehicle before opening the doors. The interior of the car was preserved like a time capsule from 1995. Sitting on the front passenger seat was a small, faded plastic cup from a local diner, a road map of Pennsylvania, and a pair of leather-work gloves. Detective Miller walked around to the back of the station wagon. He inserted a crowbar into the seam of the rear hatchback trunk and pried it open with a loud pop. The flashlight beam illuminated the trunk floor. Resting in the center of the trunk space was a heavy, wooden tool chest secured with a brass latch. Miller opened the brass latch and lifted the lid of the wooden chest. Inside the chest lay a collection of items that made Detective Vance fall to his knees in tears. Resting on top was Chloe's small yellow backpack, her pink plastic toy rake, and her kindergarten drawing notebook, the very item she had with her on the day she vanished. Beneath the notebook was the handmade yellow yarn doll with the blue dress that had gone missing from her bedroom days before her disappearance. And sitting directly beside the doll was a thick, leather-bound journal, and a stack of 3 microcassette audio tapes labeled with dates from October 1995. Detective Miller carefully lifted the leather-bound journal from the chest. He opened the front cover to the very first page. The handwriting was neat and precise, written in blue ink. It was Harlan Reed's handwriting. The journal entries detailed a dark, obsessive double life that Harlan had kept hidden from everyone he knew. Entries written in late September 1995 revealed that Harlan had grown deeply envious of Arthur's warm, happy family life. He had spent months watching the Holloway home from afar, tracking their routines, and plotting a way to tear Arthur's happiness apart. Detective Miller flipped toward the back of the journal, searching for the entry dated October 12, 1995, the day Chloe vanished. His eyes scanned the handwritten lines, and his expression transformed into a look of sheer horror. The entry described in vivid detail how Harlan had stolen the yellow yarn doll from Chloe's room, brought it to the back gate on Thursday afternoon, and used it to convince the trusting 7-year-old girl to get into his station wagon. He wrote that he had driven her out to a remote, abandoned hunting cabin deep in the Allegheny National Forest, a cabin owned by his late grandfather that no one else in town knew existed. The final entry on the page, written late on the night of October 12, 1995, contained a horrifying sentence that revealed what had happened to little Chloe that night, followed by a precise geographic coordinate marking the location of the cabin. Detective Miller closed the journal, his hands shaking as he turned to his officers. "Get state police tactical units on the radio right now," Miller ordered, his voice echoing with absolute urgency. "Harlan Reed is still alive. He's 71 years old, living alone at his house on River Road. We need to surround that property before he realizes we found locker 214. As police cruisers spun their tires and sped out of the storage facility with blue lights flashing into the dusk, Detective Miller looked at Maggie and Toby. The final clue had been found. The dark blue car was revealed, and the destination of where Chloe had been taken was now written in black and white. The truth that had been buried in silence for 25 years was finally about to be exposed. But was Harlan Reed still waiting at his cabin, or was he preparing to commit one final, devastating act before the law could reach his front door? Within 15 minutes, 4 state police cruisers with their emergency lights flashing quietly pulled onto River Road, surrounding Harlan Reed's modest wooden house. Tactical officers took up positions around the perimeter, covering the back door and side windows, while Detective Miller and retired Detective Vance walked up the front porch steps. Detective Miller knocked heavily on the front door. For a long moment, there was complete silence inside the house. Then, the heavy wooden door creaked open, revealing 71-year-old Harlan Reed standing in the hallway doorway. He was wearing an old flannel shirt, his gray hair thin and unkempt, his eyes blinking in surprise at the sight of the police officers on his porch. Harlan looked from Detective Miller to his old friend, retired Detective Vance. When Harlan's eyes met Vance's, a sudden, subtle shift crossed the old man's face. The polite, confused expression vanished, replaced by a cold, hollow stillness. "Harlan Reed," Detective Miller said, his voice firm and steady, "we have a search warrant for this property, and we have opened storage locker 214. At the mention of locker 214, Harlan's shoulders slouched, and he let out a long, heavy sigh. He did not ask what they meant. He did not demand an attorney, nor did he pretend to be confused. He simply looked down at the porch floor and held out his hands for the handcuffs. "I knew this day would come eventually," Harlan whispered, his voice trembling slightly. "I knew it every single time I looked at that house on Birch Street." Harlan was taken into custody without incident and transported directly to the Clarion Police Department. He was placed in a small interrogation room, seated across from Detective Miller and retired Detective Vance. On the wooden table between them, Miller laid out the evidence piece by piece: the faded Polaroid photograph from the birthday box, the rusted storage key, the journal recovered from the trunk of the blue station wagon, and the audio recording from 1995. For nearly an hour, Harlan sat in silence, staring at the photograph of the yellow yarn doll sitting on his passenger seat. The weight of 25 years of hidden guilt seemed to crush him right there in the chair. Finally, Harlan leaned forward, resting his face in his hands, and began to speak. He confessed to everything. Harlan explained that back in the early 90s, he had felt deeply bitter and lonely. He had watched his best friend Arthur build a happy home, raise two wonderful children, and enjoy a warm, loving marriage with Maggie. Harlan's own life felt empty by comparison, and a dark, obsessive jealousy began to take root in his mind. He decided that he wanted to inflict a pain on Arthur that would never go away, a lingering, endless tragedy that would ruin Arthur's life without ever pointing back to Harlan. In late September 1995, Harlan began planning. He noticed 7-year-old Chloe's deep attachment to her handmade yellow yarn doll. One afternoon, while visiting Arthur for Sunday coffee, Harlan quietly slipped the doll from Chloe's bedroom closet into his coat pocket. He waited for the right opportunity. On Thursday, October 12th, knowing Arthur was working overtime and Maggie was busy inside the house, Harlan drove his dark blue station wagon down the gravel access road behind Birch Street. He parked near the tree line, walked up to the back gate, and called Chloe over. When Chloe ran to the fence, Harlan pulled the yellow yarn doll from his pocket and held it out to her. Chloe gasped in joy, giggled, and uttered those 4 fateful words recorded on the neighbor's answering machine. "You brought it back." She opened the back gate willingly, smiling, and walked straight out to his car to retrieve her toy. Harlan opened the passenger door, helped her inside, and drove away before anyone in the neighborhood even noticed she was gone. Harlan drove Chloe deep into the Allegheny National Forest, to an isolated hunting cabin that had belonged to his late grandfather. The cabin was located miles down an unmarked logging trail, completely hidden from public roads. He told the police that he had planned to hold her there, but late that evening, realizing the massive police search had already begun and fearing he would eventually be caught, he made the chilling decision to end the child's life. He buried her body beneath a tall pine tree in a secluded clearing behind the cabin, taking her yellow backpack, drawing notebook, and yarn doll back with him as dark keepsakes of his crime. To ensure he would never be suspected, Harlan returned to Clarion the next morning, acted like a grieving family friend, and joined the search parties. He even used a spare key to enter the Holloway home during the chaotic first days of the search, slicing open Chloe's hidden birthday present to hide the key and photograph inside. A twisted, secretive act to keep a piece of his secret inside Arthur's house. He then drove his blue station wagon into storage locker 214, covered it up, and paid cash for the rental every month for 25 years, believing his crime would remain buried forever. While Harlan was giving his detailed confession at the police station, forensic search teams and state troopers rushed to the coordinates listed in his journal deep within the Allegheny National Forest. Just as dusk fell over the mountains, investigators located the old wooden hunting cabin. Guided by the map drawn in Harlan's journal, officers moved into the dense pine grove behind the structure. There, beneath the thick roots of an ancient pine tree, forensic teams uncovered the final, undeniable proof of the tragedy. They recovered Chloe's small remains, along with the soft wool headband that matched the piece found on the thorn branch 25 years earlier. Back at the Holloway residence on Birch Street, Detective Miller and retired Detective Vance walked up the front steps to deliver the news to Maggie and Toby. When Detective Miller sat down at the kitchen table and gently explained that Harlan had confessed and that Chloe's remains had been found at the cabin, Maggie collapsed into her son's arms. She wept hysterically, her body shaking with a profound, overwhelming grief that had been locked inside her heart for a quarter of a century. Toby held his mother tightly, tears streaming down his face as he absorbed the devastating truth. The man who had sat at their kitchen table, the man who had hugged Arthur at church, the man who had pretended to search for Chloe in the rain, he was the monster who had stolen their sweet little girl. The heartbreak was absolute, but alongside the tears, a strange, quiet sense of relief began to settle over the house. The torment of not knowing was finally over. The endless nightmare of wondering where Chloe was, whether she was still alive, or if she was suffering in some distant place had finally come to an end. The truth had been brought into the light. In early 2021, Harlan Reed was formally charged with first-degree murder, kidnapping, and obstruction of justice. Facing overwhelming physical evidence, his own recorded confession, and the items recovered from his storage locker, Harlan pleaded guilty to all charges to avoid the death penalty. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. During the sentencing hearing, 71-year-old Harlan sat in a wheelchair at the defense table, frail and silent, as Maggie Holloway stood at the podium to deliver her victim impact statement. Maggie looked directly into the eyes of the man who had destroyed her family. Her voice was steady, clear, and filled with quiet dignity. "You stole my daughter," Maggie said, her voice echoing through the courtroom. "You stole my husband's peace, and you made us live in darkness for 25 years. You thought you could hide your secret forever in a locked box, but love is stronger than your secrets. The truth found its way out, and now my little girl can finally come home." Harlan Reed spent the remainder of his life in a maximum security state prison in Pennsylvania, where he died 2 years later from natural causes, completely alone and forgotten by the world. 3 weeks after the trial concluded, on a bright, sunny afternoon in May 2021, the community of Clarion gathered at the local cemetery on the hill overlooking the town. Dozens of residents, former classmates who were now grown adults with children of their own, retired police officers, and old neighbors stood together beside a shaded plot beneath a flowering cherry blossom tree. Maggie and Toby stood at the front of the gathering. Next to the newly placed headstone for Chloe was the grave of Arthur Holloway. After 25 long years of separation, Chloe was finally being laid to rest right beside her father. Before the small wooden casket was lowered into the earth, Maggie stepped forward carrying a small, unwrapped package. It was the hand-painted wooden music box from 1995. With gentle, trembling fingers, Maggie turned the silver winding key on the bottom of the music box 3 times. She lifted the lid, placing the box carefully on top of the casket. For the very first time in 25 years, the tiny wooden ballerina inside began to spin, and the sweet, crystal-clear melody of a lullaby played softly into the quiet spring air. Everyone in attendance stood in total silence as the gentle tune echoed across the cemetery. Tears flowed freely, but they were no longer tears of uncertainty or terror. They were tears of love, honor, and final peace. Maggie smiled through her tears as the music slowly faded. She leaned down, kissed the top of the wooden box, and whispered, "Happy birthday, sweet Chloe. You're safe now." A few weeks after the funeral, Maggie and Toby completed the move to Pittsburgh. They sold the old house on Birch Street to a young family with small children, bringing new life, laughter, and light back to the property after decades of quiet sorrow. Maggie lived out her remaining years in a comfortable, sunlit apartment near Toby and his family. Though the scar on her heart would never fully heal, the terrible weight of unknown answers was gone. She spent her days surrounded by family photos, holding onto the bright, joyful memories of Chloe's laughter, her curly hair, and her colorful leaf drawings. The story of Chloe Holloway became a lasting reminder to the town of Clarion, a testament to the enduring bond of a family's love, the relentlessness of justice, and the undeniable truth that no matter how many years pass, light will always find a way to pierce through the deepest darkness.